Hello everyone, I'm here for spoiler season once again. Thank you all for tuning in. If you want to get straight to the spoilers, the timestamp is down below. In the meantime, I'm going to make you listen to me talk a little bit about Shaper and Identity Crisis. In my opinion, Shaper has had an identity crisis in the last couple of years. The faction has been many different things at different times, and I think generally they've fallen into a couple of different buckets. One is pure combo. These are things like Diaper and Cold Ones, and while I think those are fun novelty things, they're not something that people generally want to see as the mainstay of a faction's identity. Number two is Big Rig Shaper, and I think this is the style that NSG has somewhat accidentally made the most prominent and most consistent form of Shaper. And this has taken form in a lot of the cards that have ended up getting banned or defining the meta. When I think of powerful Shaper cards in the last set of NSG releases, going back from Ashes to the present, the cards are things like Simulchip, Rozeki, Lat, Endurance, Turbine, Echelon, Unity. Of those cards, outside of Simulchip, all of them are really kind of straightforward. They just say, we spend or make money in a very efficient manner. And I think that can be a cool part of a faction's identity. But I think what we've seen happen time and time again is that these either high initial upfront costs with promise of long-term returns, cards tend to lead to metagames where if they're good, people start complaining a lot because it feels like you're up against the clock, and if you're out, you're just out with really no way to get back. The other thing we see is that factions that can make that initial upfront money more efficiently, aka Anarch, generally tend to do a lot better because they can exploit those. They have a stronger early game, and then they exploit those late game tools to just completely lock out the corp at all stages of the game. But I think Simulchip is a good one to call out as probably one of the best NSG design cards, in part because it supports my favorite archetype of Shaper, which is a very toolboxy style of Shaper. This toolbox deck doesn't have cards that are hyper efficient forever, something like Unity, which never get, and Echelon, which never get any worse as the game goes on, but uses cards like Cyber Cypher or Lady or David, the latter two probably being better examples where they have really finite lifetimes. And so cards like Simulchip are really cool with how they interact with that because they reset those lifetime and allow you to turn resources from one type into another in a really fluid and kind of board gamey way, rather than just making a economic simulator of how efficiently can I make credits. Now, I don't think NSG has tried to not support this archetype. I think if you go back to Ashes, Euler, Gauss, Pelongi, all seem really trying to harken back to these style of toolbox shapers. And Propeller, I would argue, is a direct reference in many ways to Lady. But I think what we found is that the power just isn't really there, or at least hasn't really been there that the players have found. I think Arasana from the Automata initiative has been the closest we've seen in recent sets. Ultimately, I think if your name was not Extract, it was a little bit difficult to realize that power this year in the competitive season. Or maybe another way to put it is the payoffs for these narrow, efficient tools were too low relative to the power that you get by playing good stuff breakers out of Lat or good stuff breakers out of Hoshiko, which ended up kind of eating up a lot of the Shaper color pie, so to speak. When I look at new cards, one of the things I'm always trying to look at is, does this support Jeff's favorite archetype of Shaper bullshit kickflips? What I can say is I think all three of these cards will potentially have a home in Shaper kickflip decks, but also not be completely irrelevant for players that want a card pool that's a little bit more well-rounded and can support different styles of play. So here's the first spoiler. It's Trick Shot. It's a one-cost run event. It says place 4 credits on this event. You can spend hosted credits during runs. Run R&D is successful. Place 2 credits on this event and access 1 additional card when you breach R&D. When that run ends, you may run a remote server. So Trick Shot to me is a really cool spin on a card like Overclock, where you get some money on it up front, but then it has the secondary effect. If you're the one that's successful on R&D, you get to have additional credits placed on it. You get to access an additional card. But regardless of whether or not it is successful, you can then bounce over to a remote server. So this is, I think, a fun marrying of theme and mechanic. And it honestly seems like a card worth considering in a lot of Shaper decks. You can play this sort of as an overclock in the situation where R&D either has no ice or has ice that you can break cheaply for free or just bounce off of. And then this becomes a slightly worse overclock. But the reason you might want a slightly worse overclock, I would argue, is because the asset matchup, which has historically been one of the worst matchups for Shaper, where you get to now make a run on R&D and then make a run on a remote server and spend those 6 credits you get off of the trick shot to go and trash an asset. Whenever you see run events that give you credits as Shaper, your eyes tend to light up if you're playing these more toolboxy builds, though even some of the big rig decks will try and use credits on events to fire off their abilities on cards like SMC or Arasana or Simulchip to cheat install costs, because credits from placed on run events tend to be cheaper than credits on actual events. So whether Trickshot is like this niche, interesting card, it's a little bit tricky to say if it's going to like be a meta-defining card, I think, because it has some unfavorable comparisons to a card like Overclock, which sees some play, but maybe not the most play. But I think it's a very interesting card, and one that, again, can support both our kind of kickflip Shaper, where it really does seem kind of designed for, as well as just a, hey, this is an efficient card to play in a good deck. I think the next card actually kind of follows a very similar story, but this one I think is much more likely to see quite a bit of play in Standard. This is Cataloger. It is a 2-cost hardware. When you install this hardware, load 2 power counters on it. When it is empty, trash it. Whenever you make a successful run on R&D, instead of breaching R&D, you may remove 1 hosted power counter to look at the top 4 cards of R&D and arrange them in any order. And then it has another ability, which is click, hosted power counter, breach R&D. Use this ability only if you made a successful run on R&D this turn. This is a 4 influence card. And I think the thing to me about Cataloger is it can go in many, many different styles of decks. And I think that's true of the card it most strongly reminds me of, which is Indexing. Indexing has at times been a format-defining card in Shaper and outside of Shaper. And as with many of the most successful NSG remixes, it's not clear to me whether Cataloger is much stronger or much weaker or about the same power level as Indexer. I think Cataloger has some real significant advantages over Indexing. It never is going to whiff, provided you at some point make a successful run on R&D. So you you can wait until the corporate spend all of their tricks. If you get in, that's when you get to fire it off, rather than as with Indexing where you sometimes had to gamble. Another nice thing is you don't actually have to make the run back. I think it's better if you can make that run back on R&D rather than spending, a card and 3 clicks just to steal 1 agenda. It's not the worst outcome in the world, but if you can steal 2 or 3 agendas by setting up catalogers across multiple turns, that does seem to me to be a little bit stronger. But that is a downside compared to Indexing, is, hey, that click cost is significantly higher along with coming with a real credit cost. I think also it's worth saying that shuffle effects, I think, are more common than they ever have been in Netrunner, between Spin Doctor being in every deck, much like Jackson Howard used to be, but also Op being a real percentage of your matchup spread, where you do have to kind of worry about how often is the corp going to be able to shuffle at paid ability speed. Maybe that's why the clickability is on Cataloger, to make that dance a little bit more tricky for both players. But it is a bit of a downside to this, adding this card back in the meta. I haven't really mentioned Padma, but obviously Padma is going to be a consideration because this card says power counters on it, and it says R&D on it. 2 things Padma loves. I'm always going to be a little bit skeptical of Padma. I think you can probably do better. But I think Cataloger has some other really interesting synergies in the card pool, in particular Hermes. Hermes Tau did make actually some good showings in the last competitive season, and this style of card seems much better for Hermes Tau than something like Conduit or potentially even the Maker's Eye, which this card has some similarities to. The ability to kind of control agendas and see pretty deep in R&D, 1 in 4 cards is really close to the like expected frequency of agendas of about 1 in 5 in most decks. And so there's some real power there when you stack this with Hermes. I also, for those of you like me who can't get enough of environmental testing, Cataloger is going to charge that, which I think is a really nice little piece of tools, especially because we get one final card that I think doesn't go in big rig decks, but goes very, very well in these toolbox kind of Aesop's Pawn Shop, install lots of programs for different types of value cards. And this card, with probably my favorite art in the set, is Coalescence. It is a 2-cost 1MU program. It says, when you install this program, place 2 power counters on it. Hosted power counter, gain 2 credits. Use this ability only during your turn. This card would have probably been unprintable at certain times in Netrunner's history. Having a program that gives the runner credits has been an extremely potent effect for a variety of Shaper engines. Aesop's Pawn Shop for a long time defined the Shaper economy tool suite, and Cash and Harbinger, which both cost influence, were mainstays and often the first 3 influence spent when making any of those decks. Having a in-faction way to turn program installs into money is really enabling for Shaper. I think many of the coolest elements of Arasana's gameplay pattern were around using Cubon to turn a program install into memory, and Coalescence gives Arasana decks and other Aesop-style decks in the future an ability to do that again. Reglat doesn't want to spend time installing a program for 2 credits, maybe 3 credits, maybe 2 credits in an Aesop cell. Maybe Reglat could do that, but I'm a little bit skeptical. But Arasana decks have really been looking for ways to turn credits on that they use to install cards, particularly off of stuff like Urban Art Vernissage, into liquid cash. And Coalescence now gives Arasana decks a way to do that. Now, plus 2 credits to install to then gain only plus 2 credits out probably isn't good enough for a card on its own. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the space, and maybe one of the reasons this will be hard to kind of see a ton of play. But DZMZ can make this payout pretty high. Aesop's obviously increases this payout from plus 2 to plus 5. Spec work allows you to turn this plus 2 into, again, a plus 4 into cards. So there's a lot of in-faction ways for Shaper to turn this Coalescence into a bigger economy swing than it reads on the page. Environmental testing, obviously, if I'm going to shout it out for a 2-cost hardware that doesn't really synergize, I should obviously mention it with a card that seems designed to synergize with it. Another interaction that I think is really quite important here is that you can simul-chip this card back into play and make 4 credits. Now, that is an expensive use of simul-chip. Shaper decks are very often limited by their ability to use and reuse simul-chips throughout the course of a match, but against asset matchups, the one where I was like, hey, these are been where Shaper has been struggling the most, the simul-chips tend to feel like a dead card, and Coalescence turning those simul-chips into, a plus 6 net econ overall, maybe that starts helping swing the matchup a little bit more into Shaper's favor. I think it's a great revisit and exploration of the needs of some of the program-heavy Shaper decks that don't just want to install cards with the best numbers on them, but want to spend program slots tinkering and tweaking to pull off magic tricks, sliding past corp defenses that were thought to be impenetrable, and not doing it with a battering ram, but doing it with a well-placed slingshot. So these are my 3 cards for Rebellion Without Rehearsal. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for indulging me on talking a little about the Shaper archetypes, the state of the card pool, and hopefully for the next release, NSG will kick me off of Shaper so that I'll not be so boring up front. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. It really helps me feel good about the stuff I make, and number go up, feel good. I'm just a simple human being like the rest of us. Hopefully, shortly after RwR release, I can share some builds I've thought about with this, because I think with these 3 cards, Engine Deck's got a huge shot in the arm that I'm very excited to see manifest in what I think is competitive play. So thanks, and I'll see you on the net.